was no longer in the mainstream. And it's only, I think, it was the 60s and 70s that Ashish Nondi, Rajni Kothari, and others started again address this problem of decolonization of knowledge. It was also happening in other parts of India. And later on, subaltern studies from the Marxist tradition, subaltern studies, and now Aditya Nigam. So in a sense, the Marxist and the non-Marxist tradition is meeting on this ground of decolonizing theory. So it's a great privilege to chair this session. Perhaps it's the perk of a retired life, because on the panel is my teacher, Professor Partha Chatterjee, and also Sudipta Kaviraj, whom I also consider to be my teacher. And the other panelists are Sunalini, Kumar, Manindra, Thakur, and Professor Partha Chatterjee I've already said. So before we go on, Kiran Kumar will introduce the panel. So over to Kiran Kumar.
Sir, Arun sir?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just got disconnected. I think there are issues with the internet here in the campus. So, can I start?
Yeah, start, please.
Yeah,
Is Sunalini back now?
I think so.
I just confirm. Huh? She's come back. Yeah, she will speak fast, therefore I'm a bit worried about that.
No, she's not there.
But Nivedita left, so there should be space now. No?
Sad. Okay. Ask her to come back. Let's see. Okay, start, Kiran.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think due to rains in Hyderabad, it's disconnected. So I'm sorry for that. So I thank Professor Arun Kumar Patnaik for giving this opportunity. And let me introduce the chair of this webinar. International webinar and book discussion on decolonizing theory, thinking across traditions. We have with us Professor Sanjeev Mukherjee, who is chair of this panel, today's panel, and who taught political science at University of Calcutta, and he studied politics in Presidency College, and also received his PhD from Jodhpur University. And he was with CSSS, joined Calcutta University, and his interest areas are political thought, political economy, and the role of capitalist state and state and industry, the nexus and other things. And he also his interest are also in the areas of intellectual tradition of Indian secularism, and he also written a book on Russian Revolution and its impact on India. So today we have with us Professor Aditya Nigam, who is author of the book, today's book, Decolonizing Theory, Thinking Across Tradition.
I know that, but I can't do anything now. They're trying.
Aditya Nigam is now with CSTS, and his recent works has been concerned with the decolonizing of social and political theory. He has earlier worked on ideological and discursive formations and their relationship to emergence and constitution of political subjectivities. The engagement with discursive formations has led to the need of greater alternativeness to the actual thought worlds and imagination of social agents, and the need to step outside theoretical frameworks provided by standard theory, derived primarily from Western experience. In particular, he is interested in theorizing the contemporary experience of politics, populism, and democracy in the non-West, non-Western areas. The non-West as the ground for doing theory, rather than a field of for application or testing of standard frameworks derived from Western experience. And he, Aditya Nigam has also been associated with a group of South Asian scholars from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India, working around the area of idea of the post-colonial tradition. He also works with the CSDS Indian language program and its Hindi journal Pratiman. He comments regularly on contemporary political issues on the blog Kafila.online. He is the author of the different books, The Insertion of Little Slaves, The Crisis of Secular Nationalism in India, 2006, Power and Contestations, India since 1989. He written this book with Nivedita Menon. After Utopia, Modernity and Socialism and the Post-Colony, 2010, and Design Name Development, 2011. We have our panel members. Let me introduce panel members from the youngest of all the panel members. We have with us Dr. Dr. Sunalini Kumar, who recently joined, who is Associate Professor, School of Global Affairs, Ambedkar University, New Delhi. She obtained her MA from Social and Political Sciences, University of Cambridge, MPhil from Center for Comparative Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and PhD from Department of Political Science, Delhi University. And she worked on a PhD thesis, Planning, Politics and Protest, a study of urban development in the National Capital Region. She also worked as assistant professor in Lady Sri Ram College, and she was Nehru Fulbright postdoctoral fellow, Columbia University, between 2016 and 17. She was also fellow at Center for Study of Developing Studies, New Delhi. Her research interests include political theory, especially from the global south, global feminist theory, and transnational practices, and comparative histories of urbanization and developmentalism in 20th century. So she also she was awarded with so many awards, starting from JRF Net, to Nehru Centenary Scholarship from Cambridge University, Oxford Cambridge Society of Indian Scholarship, and Oxford University Prize for Best Prize presented at the Urban South Asian Conference in 2014. And she's coming up with a book, her forthcoming book, Endangering, Ungendering, Women Power and Politics in India. And she also penned down so many book chapters in different books. And this is all about our youngest speaker today, panel member. We have with us Dr. Manindra S. Thakur, who is from Center for Political Studies, New Delhi. And he obtained his research areas are social science research methods, Marxist theory, Indian politics, religion and politics, new religious movements. He also worked on different articles, journal articles, and also his paper, his news articles are very famous in Hindi news paper, Jansatta, and he is continuously writing so many articles in different journals and newspapers. We have with us very eminent professor from Columbia University, two eminent persons from Columbia University, Professor Partha Chatterjee. Professor Partha Chatterjee is a political theorist and historian. He studied at Presidency College in Calcutta and received his PhD from University of Rochester. He divides his time between Columbia University and Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, where he was the director from 1997 to 2007. He is also author for nearly around 20 books, monographs, and edited volumes, and is a founding member of Subaltern Studies Collective. He awarded with the Fukuoka Asian Culture Prize for 2009 for outstanding achievements in the field of Asian studies. He is also interesting. He is also a poet, a playwright, and actor. In the Meera Nair film, The Namesake, he played as a role of a reformed Hindu. We have with us uh, um, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, who is a specialist in intellectual history and Indian politics. He works on two fields of intellectual history, Indian social and political thought in the 19th century and 20th centuries, and modern Indian literature and cultural production. His other fields of interest and research include the historical sociology of the Indian state and some aspects of Western social theory. And he obtained his PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Prior to joining Columbia University, he taught at the Department of Political Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He has also taught political science at JNU and was an Agatha Harrison fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He is a member of Subaltern Studies Collective. Kaviraj's books include The Imaginary Institution of India 2010, Civil Society, History and Possibilities, co-edited with Sunil 2001, Politics in India, edited in 1999, and The Unhappy Consciousness, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's, and Formation of Nationalist Discourse in India, 1995. With this introduction of our speaker, I hand over the session to our chair, Professor Sanjeev Mukherjee. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiran. The format we will be following is like this, that first Aditya Nigam will introduce the book for about 10 minutes, and then the other panel members will speak. First is, I hope Sunalini has joined. First speaker is Sunalini, then Manindra Thakur, then Partha Chatterjee, and finally Sudipta Kaviraj. After the panelists have made their presentation, each of them will get 10 minutes. There will be a discussion for about 40 minutes. After that, where everybody can join, including the panelists. Then finally, Aditya will respond for about 10 minutes, and then we'll conclude with a word of thanks. So may I request Aditya Nigam to introduce the book. Aditya.
Thank you everybody. And first of all, thanks, a very big thanks to Arun Patnaik for putting this together. And I must thank you all the panelists for also agreeing to be on commenting on the book. And everybody who is here, I'm a little overwhelmed, of course, by even though it has led to a bit of a glitch in one of our speakers not being able to come. Now, what I'll do is I'll actually be very brief. I'll make 3 points, or rather one very brief, so 4 in all. And I won't talk in detail because today it is, I think, the panelists will talk about what they think about the book. So I don't think I should take too much time on explaining that. The first point is, I think, which needs to be stated very at the outset, is that decolonizing is, in the way I use it here, not about the search for a pristine, uncontaminated pre-colonial space. So when you say decolonizing, most people seem to think that it's like some kind of going back to a project which was variously nativist, indigenous, and so on and so forth. And I think part of the, a major part of the argument of the book is that there is no such space, actually. And this is not simply because there is this totalizing colonial discourse which has produced us in such a way that now there is no other way of accessing the past. That is a big question in the book, which I've tried to deal with throughout. I'll come to that. But more importantly, because India actually lies at the cusp of a very large Asia, where for a very long time we have had connections from Persia, the Arabic world, pre-Islamic Persia, Iran, and with Buddhism traveling from India to East Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. And there has been actually, in a way, India occupies a position in between, where all kinds of ideas have continuously interacted, and people have sort of responded to them in different ways. So there isn't actually, if we try to sift out anything pre-colonial, which will be very clearly identifiable as an uncontaminated space, that is certainly not what this book is trying to do. What I argue about the word decolonization in the book is supposed to indicate our capacity to engage with our times on our own terms, which is to say that we also engage with Western theory and Western philosophy on equal terms. So once, very, very long ago, I think in the 90s, Vivek Dhareshwar once used an expression which has always stayed with me, that time to end our apprenticeship with Western philosophy and Western theory is over. And I think probably what I have tried to do here is, having ended my apprenticeship, tried to think on my own feet with whatever kinds of thinking across traditions is a way of drawing from different kinds of sources, of which West certainly remains one. There is the Indian Hindu tradition, there is the Indian Islamic tradition, there is the Perso-Arabic tradition, some of which we are very only vaguely familiar with, but some of them which have some of these concepts and categories and ways of thinking actually seep into our own ways of thinking without our realizing. So that is one thing which I think one has to be clear about when we talk about decolonizing. And the second point is that one concern which runs through the book is a search for what I would call, within quotation marks, and outside. Now, in a sense, and this is actually a very long search which has, I think, made me return repeatedly. It starts with capital and the question of capitalism and so on. But practically with everything that we are dealing with, whether it is modernity, whether it is capitalism, whether it is colonial discourse, everything is presented to us as if there is no outside. So that we are always trapped within the modern, and there is no way really of resuscitating or reclaiming or claiming the agency or even the subjectivity of the non-West or the global South. I actually use non-West quite unproblematically, more or less in a way which I indicate in the book as Advaitin's way of saying not this, not that, which is not to say that Brahman, it is the Brahman is not defined in purely positive terms. You simply define it by what it is not. And so I am not very ashamed of using the term non-West. Now, the question of reclaiming or making any claims about the agency or subjectivity of the non-West or of the global South hinges upon dismantling this overarching, suffocating political structure, theoretical edifice, where even the past becomes retrospectively posited by, so modernity. Now, whether it is modernity or whether it is capitalism, non-capital is retrospectively projected as capital's past. And similarly, non-modern societies or pre-modern societies are therefore also seen as, in a way, already modern because they have, once they are touched by the modern, they no longer remain their own selves. Now, here the difficulty, therefore, of coming out of these dichotomies or of the traditional and the modern or pre-capital and non-capital has to do with a rigorous dismantling of the theoretical edifice of notions of totality and structure and so on. And when I say this, I think I should also underline that this is also my way of stepping aside or away from a specific form of an anti-historicist argument that we see most prominently in the work of someone like, let us say, Dipesh Chakravarti. Because while being overall in sympathy with Dipesh's project, I think the problem that I continuously face, and I have long discussions on both in relation to capital as well as in relation to what is the political or the modern, about Adivasi revolts and so on and so forth. And everywhere, actually, it looks like once you are within this frame, there is no redemption for you. You can only be redeemed by first trying to prove that you are political and you are modern. So Adivasi revolts, Ranajit Guha's elementary aspects, Dipesh has a discussion on that. Now, Adivasi revolts in the 19th century also have to be first proved to be political and modern so that we can even take them seriously in some fashion. So my attempt is to step outside or step away from, not outside, but step aside or step away from this kind of a anti-historicist argument, which doesn't mean that I want to go back to any kind of linear historical or historicist argument, because and that is where I come to the third point that I want to make, that every chapter in the book, so there are actually 6 chapters. The first one is, of course, more about the present theoretical conjuncture. But there are 4 basic themes which I have taken up, and there's one chapter on Zizek, which is of a slightly different kind. But there are 4 other themes which I have taken up in the book. And the first deals with modernity. Then the second theme I've taken up is the question of the political. The third is of secularism and secularity, and the fourth deals with capital and the universal history of capital. And in all of these, my attempt has been to identify the ways in which what we thought of as the past, which has been like finally obliterated and put away, actually continues to function within our present. So it is not possible to understand this in terms of a linear causality, a linear historical model where the past is superseded by the present. Because in a way, whether it is the question of caste and social polity or the mandala form, which I argue is actually present even in the ways in which dispersed foci of power continue to operate through the colonial and even into the post-colonial period. Similarly, the Puranic mode, which I argue, when I wrote the book, of course, this Thali on COVID-19 had not happened. And all the ways in which we saw the Puranic being enacted in a bizarre way at an all India level. But in a sense, the Puranic mode continues to be active part of our present. It is not a past which has been eliminated. Similarly, when we talk of non-capital, my long argument or discussion partly deals with one of the most otherwise fascinating undertakings by Kulan Channel, who ultimately gets out of the problem by saying that this non-capital is only posited by capital. That is the only way in which you can actually circumvent the problem of non-capital ever being fully superseded by capital. So I think that all these lead me to, and that is my final last 4th point, which is If I were to put in one word or one expression, what I'm trying to do with these concepts and categories, I think my primary concern has been with what I call borrowing from Ernest Bloch, non-synchronous synchronicities, which itself problematizes this idea of a linear historical model of past, present, future, and so on, because there is always a commingling of or co-presence of different times. So I will end with this, and I will leave it now to the judgment or the comments of my panelists, whom are my teachers. Yes.
Thank you. So, Sunalini? Is Sunalini there?
I don't think she could come in.
Achha, achha. So the first of the panelists is Manindra Thakur from CPS JNU. He will speak for 10 minutes. Please try to keep the time limit in mind. Manindra, please.
Please warn me a couple of minutes prior to the end of my time. Thank you, Arun, for this opportunity to discuss Aditya's book, which I think is a significant intervention in the debate on decolonizing, in which our generation and generation below me are deeply interested, and they are not finding out any way. And how do we decolonize ourselves? How do we decolonize our thinking and mind? And he presents a kind of idea which needs to be taken seriously and examined and explored. I will focus on 2-3 points only. 2-3 gaps that I realized were there, which I would like to request Aditya to reflect upon, and a couple of important points that I think he makes, and I have some problems there. One is that the point that Professor Kaviraj makes, and he kind of accepts that point, is the problem with Indian intellectual tradition of not reflecting upon social and political. This is a point that we have been grappling with since long, and I have been engaging with my Sanskrit friends in JNU, that whether we do have anything, any reflection of Sanskrit scholars on colonialism or on capitalism or not. And they are trying to convince me that there are books and articles, but I'm yet to get them. I think that I'm surprised why this question is important for me, that when I see that the text on Indian philosophy begins with this assumption that the purpose of the knowledge is to solve 3 problems, the Trividta, Daihik, Daivik, and Bhautikta. So if that is the purpose of the knowledge, then how does it not connect with the social? And how does it not connect with the political? Similarly, the knower, what is the aim of the knower? The aim of the knower is that na tvam kame rajyam, na swargam, na punarbhavam, na kame duktaptanam, praninam arthanashanam. Means the purpose of the knowledge is solving the problem of the human beings, and the knower's main aim of life is to resolve those crises and the issues. So if that is true, then how is it that our tradition is not connected with the social and the political? Is it that it is not connected with the social and political in the way in the West it is being connected? The other issue related to this, I have a feeling, is that are we not able to see the linkages between different kind of texts, the intertextuality that you talk about? For instance, while doing the field work in the region where Nyaya philosophy was very popular almost for 1,000 years, that is a Mithila, they told me that, see, the text like Arthashastra, Kamsutra, Yagyavalk Samhita, and Panchtantra, all these texts are connected by one simple philosophical school, that is Nyaya philosophy, that is the Indian realism. Is it that since we are reading them in a very fragmented way, therefore we are not able to capture the link between the philosophy and the social and the political? I think a similar problem one can visualize when one looks at the text called Panchtantra. What has come to us in last few decades is a fragmented Panchtantra. Different stories. We don't read them as a single story, written by somebody who was already 80 years old, who was well versed with all intellectual traditions of India, and then he was writing stories for kids. So these are not simple stories. They must be very much loaded with a lot of philosophical arguments and all that. So is it that we are missing something there? And Aditya, though, makes this point, accepts it uncritically, I guess, and doesn't try to explore in these areas. I think Gandhi could catch it. For instance, the story of Panchtantra, story of Premchand's story of Panch Parameshwara. And this is a very interesting story where we can see that the political, the social, the ethical, the legal, everything is working together. And this non-bifurcation of these things may be the core idea of this discourse, which we are trying to explore. And from there, we can then engage with the West instead of engaging from the Western idea of this bifurcation and trying to explore something in Indian tradition. The second point I think Aditya has made very interestingly is that we need to think through the traditions, across the traditions, which I think nobody would disagree with at this moment, that there are intellectual traditions and they were earlier also in interaction. There are books suggesting now that the Greek society and Indian society were deep in interaction through the Arab world. And also there was impact on India similarly. So nobody would deny that. The point is that if we want to decolonize ourselves, do we need to anchor somewhere? Do we need to anchor somewhere which Aditya says that we are more familiar with? Or what you said is we are unconsciously or subconsciously part of that. Because it seems that, and that's my project when I'm doing my field work in Nyaya and Tantric villages, trying to see that how far the people, common people, are being guided by these traditional philosophies. How do they negotiate between modernity and these philosophical arguments and basis, traditions? I think that's very interesting finding that one can easily see that they are very deeply embedded in those traditions. Like in a village in Mithila, where Ayachi Misra was there in the 1400. Even today, they are not only preserving the book, they have preserved his deed. Deed is the piece of land that is where his house was, and they have recently renovated a lot of things there. So probably, and my Sanskrit friend say that you need to anchor somewhere. Unless you anchor, we can't even debate. So would you consider this point, Aditya, that even if we agree with this, that we have to engage in a cross-tradition dialogue, there is a need to anchoring. Okay. Do I have 2-3 more minutes? Okay. So, and then if we are anchoring, I would like you to also reflect on other point that I think is very close to your heart. That is the idea of liberation. And what Marx says that freedom of yours should be guarantee of freedom of me, and freedom of mine should be guarantee of freedom of yours. So do you need to have anchor on the one hand in one tradition, and there also you need constantly kind of being critical to that and to other traditions via this idea of human liberation. And that is what engaging with the question of Trividha, the solving the problem of Trividha. I really liked immensely your critique of Zizek, his audacity to comment on Tantricism. I think it's such a deep philosophy, such a powerful philosophy. And I'm trying to reach not through the text, I'm trying to reach through the practice in a village in Assam, which is called Mayang. It is not black magic. I think there was a problem with defining it. And they are so ethical. there's ethics of Tantricism, which people don't understand, and they reduce it to something like black magic. Second thing, what is troubling the West, I think, and where Western people are approaching Tantricism is not actually philosophy. Unfortunately, it's sexuality. Most of the websites I have visited on Tantricism in the West, they are about tantric sexuality. And I can understand their problem because they have delinked the sexuality from the mental act. It's only the physical act. Tantricism probably connects that with the mental, therefore they find it very exciting. So probably that critique is wonderful and needs to be expanded further. Now, three gaps that I realized I could point towards. One is that, do you also think, since you have quoted Gogi, that African writer, that decolonizing requires doing it through a certain kind of language? And I would like to quote this Japanese school of philosophy. The way they are doing philosophy, they are trying to argue things within that frame of language. Do you think that is important? And you yourself have been arguing about it, I guess. Similarly, for instance, if you look at Hazare Prasad Dwivedi's writings and his metaphor of Tantra Sadhana, on which Namvar Singh comments very interestingly, that how we have to engage with our tradition as if the Tantric is doing Shav Sadhana, when Shav actually tilts its face. His book, Anam Das Ka Potha, I think it's a wonderful intervention in the way we must look at our own tradition, where the protagonist says that, well, if the philosophy doesn't solve our problem, it is useless. It has to solve our problem. It is not an isolated act, as you have mentioned that probably we need to redefine philosophy in order to engage with Indian intellectual traditions. Second thing is that you have not mentioned even nowhere, neither when you're speaking or when you're writing, the group of people who were taking up this project earlier also, like KJ Shah and JPS Oberoi and A.K. Sharan, the Lucknow School of Sociology and all that. I think they were making significant points, and they were not like the nationalist kind of people, as you rightly have mentioned, that this is one agenda where knowledge is connected with identity, and then it loses its content actually. And the last thing, I think, how do we decolonize? Do we decolonize only by engaging with the critique of these traditions, or do we decolonize by engaging in a practice? So mapping the knowledge and practice that is happening today, how the people who were carrying the knowledge community, how do they were in the practice, and in what kind of practice they were, how much it was deliberative, and what can be done there. I mean, I am reminded of what you have quoted, the Kartabhaj tradition. One of my students is writing a very interesting paper and critiquing that modernist way of looking at Kartabhaj tradition. So I think these are issues that we need to engage with. Thank you. I hope I'm...
Thanks. Thanks.
I think you have to stop here. Huh?
I've stopped.
Please stop. And Sunalini is in.
Yeah, finish your point.
He finished.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. So I think Sunalini is back. And so now we may I request Sunalini to make a presentation. She'll get 10 minutes time.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm really sorry about missing Aditya's opening remarks. I'm sure that I would have learned something from them. So I don't really have, I feel like in some ways being also from the same discipline as Aditya, of course, many of us here in this panel are. I don't feel like I have anything in a way from the outside to offer, but I thought that I would maybe put down what I feel I got from the book as a fellow traveler in political science. So because I don't want to run out of time, if it's okay, I'm just going to read a little bit. And you said 10 minutes? Yeah, okay, that's a little less than I thought. But let me just say a couple of things then. The first point I just wanted to make is kind of personal and again to do with the journey of being a political scientist. And this is something that I think Aditya and others here would be able to relate to. So the first feeling I had when I picked up your book and I started reading it, Aditya, was actually great relief. Because it's, I think studying political science in India, it's a bit like a coming of age story. So it's a bit like a maturing adult has been harboring severe and crippling doubts that her parents are wrong about several critical fundamental things, but hasn't quite found the language to do so, and nevertheless bristles a bit when somebody from a neighboring house actually points that out. So it's as if we've had this kind of these like series of discomforts, severe sort of misgivings about the discipline that we were located in. And so when I picked up Aditya's book and I started reading it, it just felt like there was this tremendous sense of relief that somebody was simply putting all of those doubts and those misgivings, and without a shred of self-consciousness or without a shred of defensiveness on the paper. And so I got the feeling that all these years that I've been having all these doubts, that I've been engaging with this discipline both as a student and as a teacher, there has been this kind of I've had a shadow self far more committed and disciplined than I, who had been applying themselves with rigor to the sweep of questions and debates explored in the book. And there I'd like to really, I'd like to use a provocative word. I think the range of things that Aditya has actually sought to address in this book are actually quite promiscuous. And I think quite sort of delightfully so. And there is this kind of refusal to be bogged down by any of the conventions of what is it that one is supposed to address within a disciplinary perspective, even one that is within a critical disciplinary perspective. So these are the questions that just to say that these are the questions that I would have liked to ask. These are the questions that I've seen colleagues and friends that we've had debates with want to raise, and we've never had much of a roadmap in terms of answers. So we've had some, there were some bright spots. We remember the excitement that we felt when we read Professor Sudipta Kaviraj and Partha Chatterjee's work. But yeah, there were few and far between, and for most of the time we've been sort of, thrashing about in the thickets. All of us talk about decolonizing theory, but most of us have actually not ventured too close to the way in which Indian political thought is actually organized in Indian political science departments, because that has its own very, very specific and somewhat rigid politics, disciplinary politics. So, we have sort of, so for all of that, for all of those reasons, this was a wonderful, robust, yet quite thoughtful and delicate engagement with some of the questions that I personally have been grappling with. So one of the ways in which we used to be able to address this question of decolonization and the problems of political science, especially in the global South, was to take history seriously. That was one of the solutions we had. And it wasn't quite a solution, because Aditya himself says that history is in fact part of the problem. History with a capital H is part of the problem. It is the way in which it organizes time in a unilinear way. I mean, I don't need to actually lay that out. That's very, very clear and very nicely done in the book. The problems with history with a capital, with historicizing in a particular way. It's part of the universalizing project. It's part of the totalizing and the systematizing project of modern social sciences. So after brief forays into history, that was dissatisfying as well. And, so we've moved away from that as well. In a way, so, this is why the book, I think, is so urgent and so important. And one of the ways, I mean, I would have actually, it's the sweep of this book is actually so ambitious. And as I said, being a fellow political scientist, don't have any critical perspective from the outside to offer. The sensible thing to do when Arun Patnaik asked me to participate in this panel would have been to say no, for these reasons. But I just, the only reason that I feel like I have had I may have something, to actually think about in terms of this book, is because I've also been a fellow traveler with Aditya on this blog that we write on together, Kafila. And in a way, it was very, very interesting for me to see how the kind of daily engagements, almost daily engagements with politics, Aditya as a political commentator who is engaging with the present in a very, very kind of real sense, in a very immediate and urgent sense. Sort of how does he also write in the mode of a person who's trying to decolonize theory? Like, how does he write? How do the two registers speak to each other? And that again had been a very fruitful sort of exercise once I actually started reading his ideas. So the speaker before me, I don't know how many people spoke before me. I was logged out. I just got back in. But I think the speakers before me would have spoken about what is important in this project. But one of the things that I found, and I'm just going to read out this passage a little bit. But, you know, so there are certain achievements of this book. I mean, there's the thing about the critique of Zizek, which I think a lot of us enjoyed. It was waiting to be done. Its time had come and somebody needed to do that takedown. And so that was wonderful. There were some very, very strong passages in terms of, I think, the critique of the whole idea of the outside of capital and whether capital can have an outside, or does it also subsume its outside, in terms of the debates around Kalyan Sanyal's work. That those were, I think, very, very strong and very beautifully done. But the thing that I find when I actually put Aditya as a political commentator and as somebody who's writing in this register of theory, if I put them together, is this kind of resolute post-structuralism. And here, you know, I just wanted to say that over the years, I've seen that, you know, he has a sharp ear to the ground politically, but there is this kind of resolute refusal to systematize and totalize any of the interesting insights or any of the interesting formulations that are coming out of his writing. And this can be frustrating for people who are actually reading him. I found myself as amongst one of those people who actually read him. But you know, especially when things were getting, you know, out of hand, it looked like, you know, the polemics were becoming strong. There were people who had neat and systematized ideas on the other side. When, you know, the winds of change were blowing the rickety house of Indian democracy to the ground, and there wasn't a single hopeful event on the horizon. Most of us would want to say this is the triumph, and I want to put all of this in capitals, triumph of capitalist Hindutvavadi fascism, right? T, C, H, and F all in capitals. But Aditya just refused. So he will keep his theoretical feet firmly on the ground. And he would remind us of the universalizing historicist logic of even using a self-evident word like fascist with a capital F. So instead he has used words like, so, you know, the problem with using fascist with a capital F is to dilute, to show all latter experiences of fascism or fascistic tendencies. And I really like this one word. I don't know if it's a neologism that you have invented, Aditya, but fascistoid tendencies. As, you know, as perversions or partial or non-European forms of, even, you know, like, they're not even good at fascism. I mean, this is one of the things that in the post-colonial world or in the global south, we find it so hard to grapple with. Is it that we can't even get our authoritarianism and our fascism right? So, you know, he has absolutely resisted the tendency to put anything with those capital Fs. However, I think that, because I think 10 minutes is probably, do I have a couple of more minutes?
You have about 1 minute left.
Okay, so I've barely gotten into saying the more important things I was saying, but just Aditya, a couple of things that I felt were left open for me.
Fine.
Yes?
You finish your point. You take another minute if you want. You finish your
another minute is the absolute minimum. But no, so some things I think that were just left open for me. So 3 brief sets of comments. One, this idea of power as dispersed and of the mandala form of governance and, you know, organization of political power in India. I think that there needs to be some thinking through in terms of what happens to the political. And you use this phrase, the birth of the political, and you're using it not uncritically. You're using it partly ironically and all of that in the context of the arrival of modernity in post-colonial societies or colonized societies. But I think that there's something that is unfinished in this. I'm not saying unfinished in the, of course it will be unfinished because in a sense your project was to open this up, but I think that something needs to be thought through carefully in terms of what the political, how the political is placed and how it transforms at the moment of early colonialism. And I had an example from somebody who I think is quite rightly criticized in other areas, but who I think has a very insightful point in this area, which is Chris Bailey and his understanding of how non-political classes like Hindu merchants came to occupy town offices, municipal offices, and how there was this kind of transfer of political elites that took place in early colonialism. So how does the colonial complex actually then sit comfortably with the mandala form and so on, and what happens to it if nothing else? I had a point on language, but I think Manindra Thakur before me has made that very well. Let me just end with this provocation, which is that, you know, so we've looked at regular political theory, we've looked at decolonizing political theory, we've looked at political theory versus social theory. Do we have a self-contained realm of the political? Can we even speak of the political in certain ways? My question right at the end would simply be, it's a provocation really, do we need theory at all? I mean, when we have said neti, 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 when we have said not this, not this, not this, and I'm saying it not to, you know, say something clever or say that not, you know, not in a nihilistic sense, but to say precisely that is theory itself a mode of understanding the world that is inescapably totalizing, universalizing, systematizing. And if we don't need to think about modernity in its global and non-European forms as a kind of, you know, self-replicating or self-differentiating, in your discussion of Kaviraj, you've spoken about that and the problems with that possibly, then do we need theory at all? And the reason I'm asking this is because most of us are here doing any kind of theory because we are engaged with ethical, moral, and political horizons within which theory has placed itself, where it solved the problem of the individual and of the collective and of power in a very particular way and monopolize those questions in a particular way. But we are still engaged in those questions. And so what would ideas of the individual, decency, the civic, the political, legal, liberal, free, and so on mean? What do they mean in our current political life? And do we even need theory of any kind at all to engage with those questions? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Sunalini. You made very provocative points, especially in the conclusion. Now may I request Professor Partha Chatterjee, Partha, to speak.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity both to read the book carefully and also to comment on it. I have very specific points to make in relation to what Aditya has said in various parts of the book. So I assume that most of you, at least many of you, have at least glanced through the book. But before I make my specific points, let me just make the broad comment welcoming and in fact congratulating Aditya for what I think is a remarkable accomplishment, because what he's able to do is actually take stock of an exercise which Aditya himself recognizes, that Indian thinkers have actually grappled with for at least 200 years or so. And Aditya has somehow managed to produce a kind of comprehensive conceptual account of several of the crucial problems, issues that have arisen and that still remain unresolved. And he's asking the question, how do we proceed to resolve some of them? And I think it's a very remarkable. He's also made a very bold and original claim. He has a thesis in this book. And I think that makes it easier also to respond, because there is something one has in front of one, a kind of a Purva Paksha with whom one can seriously engage. So I have, Aditya said there are 6 chapters in the book, and I have 6 points to make. But Aditya also has an introduction and a conclusion. There's one chapter on which I have absolutely nothing to say, and that is the chapter on Zizek, because I have absolutely no opinion on contemporary European Marxism. So let's leave that aside. Now, on the other points, the first of all, on generally from this is the I think the first chapter. He raises this question of decolonization, and especially the way in which Latin American writers in particular have raised this point. People like Walter Mignolo and Dussel, etc., Quijano, and their main argument is they sort of disagree with the whole post-colonial argument, because in a sense there is something very specific about the colonial experience of the Americas, which first of all runs over several centuries. And there is one point in particular which Aditya has just sort of mentioned, but not, I think, something that lies at the very heart of this problem of decolonization. And that's the question of language. You see, in the Latin American case, colonialism intrusion was so deep and violent that in fact the native American languages were either obliterated or repressed in such a way that for at least the last 100, 200 years perhaps, the only language in which even the indigenous Americans or people of mixed race could think, were allowed to think, was in the imperial languages, Spanish or Portuguese. The interesting problem is that this is not the case in most Asian countries, and certainly not in India. So it wasn't as though the colonial intrusion wiped out the Indian languages. And that, I think, is important, because Aditya raises this interesting essay by K.C. Bhattacharya on Swaraj in Ideas. This is something we discussed a few weeks ago in this very sort of webinar series. And K.C. Bhattacharya says that the problem that he was discussing, how to do philosophy in an original and rooted way, he was saying that he could not make that discussion in Bengali. Now, I think the point is 100 years later, I don't think that is a valid question. It's not simply that serious thinkers cannot actually do the same discussion in an Indian language, but in fact, even the college students that K.C. Bhattacharya was talking to, today college students, university students, the vast majority of them, when they do philosophy, when they read philosophy or when they read political science, they read it in an Indian language. So I think that is an important question which we think, Aditya, I wish he had engaged with this question more seriously, which is, what are the lives of the various concepts that may have originated from the West, but what are their lives when they've been domesticated in various ways in the different Indian languages? And my sense is that if you look at particular Indian languages, these lives are not exactly the same. There are different ways in which they have been domesticated. So that's the first point. Second, I have a particular way in which to resolve the problem that Aditya raises about Sudipta Kaviraj's discussion on the symmetric and sequential forms of modernity. Because Aditya, basically to critique Sudipta, he suggests that it was never true that all of those elements of Western modernity were actually indigenous to the West. And Aditya goes into a long historical discussion of how several of those elements actually originated from the Arabs, for instance. And you can expand the list. Now, the particular way in which Aditya raises this problem, actually, it seems to me, can be resolved by specific genealogies. And in fact, Aditya does use the word genealogy. So particular elements of Western modernity, you can have very distinct genealogies for each of them, which may lead far away from Europe. That itself is not the problem. What is interesting and important, and this I think Sudipta must insist on, which is that these various elements come together almost like a chemical compound to produce something new, a new entity, which is being called modernity. And that modernity has properties which none of those elements individually have. That's the new product now. And Sudipta's argument was, Sudipta then complicates this idea because he is saying that whether those elements, let's say A, B, C, whether they are combined in that sequence, A, B, C, or B, C, A, or C, A, B, actually will make a difference. So that the product, which may still be modernity, will have somewhat different properties depending on in what sequence these elements were combined. And that is what Sudipta is suggesting you will get when supposedly the same elements are arriving or being used or combined in a non-Western context. Because if the sequence is different, the result will also be different. And of course, Sudipta has several examples of this. So it seems to me that that is really Sudipta's claim. And I'm not sure that Aditya's argument that the genealogies may lead out of Europe is necessarily, it damages that particular claim. Third, on the question of the dispersed nature of political power in India, I completely agree with the general thrust of Aditya's discussion there, except for 2 points. One is that I'm not sure that the mandala analogy is actually appropriate. I mean, mandala drawn from Kautilya's Arthashastra, because those who are familiar with that text, that chapter on mandala yoni, the argument there, Kautilya is offering a kind of strategic idea, notion, where he describes how, and what is crucial is that this is an advice or a strategy that is being offered, a strategic set of strategies being offered to a king who wants to be victorious. So it's the Vijigishu king, right? And Kautilya has all of these arguments about the immediate, the states that are immediately in the neighborhood, states that are one step removed, enemies and allies among them. And depending on particular combinations, he has different techniques to offer. How this Vijigishu Raja, the one who wants to dominate both enemies and allies, must act. So it's a very specific idea. It's not generally a question of dispersed power. We know we have dispersed power, and I broadly agree with this. But there's a second idea also. And this again, I think Aditya somewhat minimizes, which is particularly in the phase of, let's say, ever since, let's say with the Mughals, let us leave out the earlier large imperial formations. With the Mughals, there is a certain aura of sovereign majesty, which is created in the period of the Mughals, which it seems to me has a very powerful symbolic, ideological, emotional effect, to the extent that it is, I mean, of course, there is a certain formal centralization of bureaucratic power, of revenue systems and so on. We know all that. But power still remains dispersed, I agree. But the aura of a sovereign empire with a center remains. And the power is such that even, for instance, when you have, let's say, Marathas, Shivaji, for instance, they seek a certain recognition from the Mughals. In fact, the Marathas end up basically acting as on behalf of the Mughal emperor. You have the various principalities who also do the. Tipu, for instance, seeks approval and is refused. The rebels of 1857 who bring a Mughal emperor reluctant, drag him kicking and screaming and force him to become the leader, declare himself the leader of the revolt. So I think that is important, because if you come to later nationalist leaders, Nehru, for instance, Nehru's discovery of India is actually trying to seek this precisely the historical antecedents of a sovereign centralized state, nation state in the past empires. I don't think that the appeal of that formation is necessarily to be minimized. So 3, 4. This is the question. Sorry?
I think you have to, just shorten your...
Well, there are several others which we can talk about later on. I was thinking of particularly the question. Well, there's a crucial question of Polan Shanal's book, because it seems to me that there is a misreading of Shanal's argument, because Polan does not say that traditional agriculture or traditional artisanal is non-capital and can be subsumed by capital. The non-capital is a creation because it is a consequence of primitive accumulation. And I think that is a particularly important question. So the real question, it seems to me now, is if one is to take seriously Aditya's argument about the non-synchronous, to what extent there is, he shows quite well that the distinction between a synchronous and the non-synchronous, and that there is a large zone which remains, which is non-synchronous. But is the gap between the synchronous and the non-synchronous being reduced? And that, I think, is an important question, because there is the whole question of the spread of both market forces, of state welfare benefits, projects, and so on, of technology, particularly technologies of communication. The mobile phone, for instance, what has it done to centralizing an entire system of communications? Is this zone between gap between the modern and the paramodern, is it being closed? And primitive accumulation is a force that is being pushed. So if you go back to the question that Sunalini was raising about what is the Hindutva force doing, one of the things it's doing, we can see it right now, at a moment when normal politics is suspended, to push through legal administrative methods to facilitate further primitive accumulation as quickly as possible. This, I'm suggesting, is a force, it's a real force, which is probably reducing this gap between the modern and the paramodern, what Aditya is calling. So finally, therefore, the final question that Aditya leaves us with, which is, how do we frame our questions? I think the crucial problem there is, who is the we? In who is framing the questions? Is there a social force, a social agency that is involved here? And that, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Partha. The panelists will get a chance to speak during the discussion. So our next speaker is Sudipta Kaviraj. So may I request Sudipta to come?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, my thanks to Aditya for writing this book, and to Arun for organizing the discussion. I joined Partha in congratulating Aditya for writing this book. I would like to start by reminding ourselves of something which is interesting. The great similarity between the titles of Dipesh's book, Provincializing Europe, starting with a verb and then a noun, and Aditya's book, Decolonizing Theory, you can turn provincializing into decolonizing, and Europe, of course, is theory. So the question would be that but I think the fact that after Europe was provincialized in 2000, that's when the book came out. Why do we need a book in 2020 which needs to decolonize Europe again or decolonize theory again? So I think it's also reflected in the title of both books, that it's essentially a process which has to be started, and in order to start the process, we have to recognize the need for the process itself, which I think Dipesh's book emphasizes. Aditya's book also emphasizes. What I liked about the book is, as Partha said, it's a kind of sweep of the book, asking us to realize that the enormity of the task of seriously understanding our society, our present and history, the enormous amount that needs to be done, and the different types of difficulties in its path. So I also wrote out something like Sunalini. I wouldn't read it because it would be too long. But let me just make the points quickly. Decolonizing can be, this is what I think is reflected in both the title and the way Aditya's book is written, which I like, that decolonizing can actually lead to a kind of denunciation, that saying that, the theory that we work with does not explain our societies because it comes from somewhere else. Denunciation does not lead anywhere. I think it's important to notice that. So the denunciation is important. But simply shouting more and more loudly that Marx and Weber does not apply to India doesn't take us anywhere, because it's not Marx's fault or Weber's fault that we take their theorizing about the state too seriously and want to apply it to India. So if they say that this applies to India, all that we need is to say that, it does not. But then after that, the main task remains to be done. That is, how do we try to understand our history? What I like about Aditya is also, in a certain sense, the logical construction of the book. He starts with the question of modernity, and I might have some small differences with Aditya on this. He also, honored me by engaging with that argument about the theory of modernity at great length. I think he also realizes that, it is actually meant not as a provocation. I don't think I meant it to be a provocation. I meant it to be an intervention in which I wanted to say that, look, if we want to think seriously about our modernity, we must read Marx and Weber, but we must also learn how to leave Marx and Weber behind and think on our own, which we ordinarily do not do. And I think he agrees with me there. And I also find something very congenial to my own thinking, that he has disaggregated modernity into various elements, and these elements are also my elements, in a sense that, it's the constitution of the political, the constitution of the religious secular, binary, or the religious secular process, and the constitution of the economic and capitalism. So I think I'm actually very comfortable with that, and I think it expands on the kind of thinking that I like. A couple of questions there, very quickly, but you will see that these questions are very large, and one can easily write a short note or article on this. But so I'll do it telegraphically to see how Aditya responds to this. I think there is a reference to the question of epistemicide, which I see in my surroundings in Colombia very often. I think it's not an easy problem. I shall end with this at the very end of my remark. But I think we should ask, what does it mean to say that colonialism has actually disconnected us from our knowledge? It's a complicated question. Manindra's remarks actually showed that I think it raises questions for me. It shows that in Mithila, which is the great place of Navya, I come from a town which was a great place of Navya in Bengal, Navadvip. He says that there is a kind of memory of that sort of thing still active there, but it's not an I would not accept if people say that we have a fluent capacity to use those systems of knowledge. And the question would be to ask, would those systems of knowledge have helped us in trying to encounter intellectually and epistemically the world that we face out today? I don't think it would. I don't think, any reading of the Arthashastra or even Shukraniti, which has a very different take on caste. Remember that Shukraniti is supposed to have been written by Shukracharya, who is the guru of the Daityas, of the Danavas. So it's an alternative, counterpuntal view from inside the Hindu tradition. But even that, I don't think would actually help us very much to theorize democracy as we experience it today, both the good parts of democracy and the degeneration of democracy. I think we need to take theory which originated in Europe and then to bend it. And so let me make one very quick point here. I've made this point earlier. We must understand how theory exists in the world. And I would put it very sharply that, in theory, there are two things. One is a mode of giving the theory and a mode of taking the theory. When the theorist presents the theory to us, there's an expectation that, we would take the theory as a whole and agree or disagree. But what we normally do is to do what children do when they're presented with a Lego toy. They do it according to the instructions for the first time. And next time, they simply take it apart and do it according to their own imagination. I think theory is taken, not given like that. It's given like a set of instructions, but it is taken in this kind of Lego process that we disaggregate it. We disaggregate it, we ingest it, use it for our own purposes. And I think that is what we probably do already with Western theory, but when we don't do enough. I'll give you 3 examples where I think Aditya and all of us should put more effort. For instance, Partha's distinction between civil and political society, which obviously takes from Gramsci, Hegel, etc., but he repurposed it for something completely different. When I tried to think about what happens to identities, I read Choni. It didn't give me very much. So I had to make a distinction between what I call the fuzzy and the enumerated identities. Aditya does something which is very similar. I don't think he runs sufficiently long with that. For instance, when he is trying to devise the idea of the paramodern, I think he's into something which is somewhat similar. But I think my dissatisfaction is that I think he actually stops too early after thinking about it. That's the kind of thing that we should try to expand. Very quickly, I think the question of the political, we should think more closely about the question of sovereignty. I think sovereignty is a dual concept. Part of it is a descriptive concept. It describes what is in the world. But sovereignty is also, like Kant's regulatory ideals in ethics, it's a regulative, I would not say regulative, let us call it a reality creating concept. That is, if people take that to be true, it's an as-if concept in some ways, as some people put it. If people take it to be true, then it applies a certain pressure, constitutive pressure on their behavior. And through that, that concept or the reality invoked by that or imagined by that concept actually comes to be realized in the literal sense of the term, that it becomes real in the real world. So I think we should look into the question of the constitution of sovereignty, both in the past, and I agree with Aditya, I'm also an admirer of the unfinished attempt in Bhupendranath Datta's book, Studied in Indian Social Politics. So I'm very happy about that. There's also something else in our political tradition, which I think we should make more of. In the 19th century, I think there's a long, very robust tradition in our own thinking, in the vernacular particularly, in Uday, Rabindranath, etc., in Bengal, but in other parts of India as well, which is the kind of thought that goes intensely against the import of the model of the European nation state in our society. I think that has gone unnoticed because we do not look at our own vernacular tradition. Two very quick points. I would not touch on the Kolal Shanlal thing because Partha has done it beautifully. I'm glad that Partha, Aditya talks about post-secular secularism. So he takes the argument about secularism very seriously. And my own thinking is that we should go back to the question of disenchantment in Weber. I think it's a word which is not entirely a concept in Weber, but because it occurs at a very remarkable, startling way, we tend to use it as a concept. The difficulty of using it as a concept is that it has a kind of deeply obscure interior, because half of the concept enchantment can mean many different things. It can mean belief in a transcendent God. It also mean belief in a goblin which is hiding on the tree, etc. So I think we should look at this much more closely and work on that theoretical apparatus again, to make it usable in our kind of context. So finally, I want to make 2 points very quickly. We should ask the question, what makes our thinking Indian? There are 2 ways in which we can claim that our thinking is Indian. One is historical, that the conceptual apparatus through which I think about my world comes from Indian history. It comes from Nyaya, or it comes from Kautilya, or it comes from Shukraniti, or it comes from Abhinavagupta, or whatever, if I'm thinking about something else. I don't think our thinking can be Indian in that sense very easily because of the colonial history and our disconnection with our past. It remains our past, but it is actually much more inaccessible than a past about which we can say that it is our agama. Our history is not our agama. It is not a history which has actually come down to us in a still usable form. But I think our thinking is Indian, not because of our history, but because of our present. That is, we experience modernity very differently. We experience sovereignty, secularization processes, the coming of the capitalist economy, all very differently. Because the world that modernity creates is not a world of uniformity, but a world of self-realization. And if that is true, then I think what we should try to do should be to make the concepts obey the logic of our experience and try to theorize sort of following that. So finally, I would like to make a very quick remark about what then does decolonizing mean. Aditya's book has something in the title which Dipesh's book does not have to the same extent. Thinking across traditions. And Aditya's own work sometimes, their work on the use of theory in PW, etc., they try to draw upon some resources of the Islamic tradition, some resources on Buddhist tradition, etc., which is fine. But I personally feel that, this is something which is very difficult for our generation people to do, because we are already constituted by a certain kind of intellectual process in which we are totally disconnected from our tradition. Getting connected to our tradition is very hard. We have to learn the language, which we do not have. Learning the language is not enough because every theoretical sentence has behind it a very large background of interconnected ideas and assumptions, background thinking and things like that. So it is very, very hard, to get back to that and try to acquire a fluency in that or mastery in that, which is sufficient to integrate it into our serious theoretical thinking. I think we ought to do it. but we must also understand the hardness of it, the difficulty of it. So I would argue that in our generation, what we should try to do should be to try to bend the concepts, as I said before, because that is something that we can do more easily. But at the same time, I think we should try to change the educational system in such a way that somebody who is coming into the university and becoming a political scientist today is not given the kind of education that I had in presidency college. We had some good things about it, but the bad thing about it was it completely estranged the world of Indian thinking from me. And estrangement, obviously, is not just something being strange. The power of the word estrangement is that something which should not be strange to me is made strange. So estrangement is an effortful process by which we try to sort of distance ourselves from something, which should have been actually the closest to us and available to us without any effort. So I think decolonizing, the enterprise of decolonizing in a country like ours, and I would go back to the point that Partha made very quickly, but I think the enormity of that point is very important. I'm engaged in a discussion with Jim Tully about deparochializing political theory. That book, I think, will come out in the coming year. We have all written our essays. That partly raises that question, that the effect of colonialism is very different in different parts of the world. So the effect of colonialism in Latin America totally divests them of their language. The effect of colonialism on the Black population in America is very similar, right? But our situation is not like that. And Jim Tully focuses very deeply on the experience of the Inuit people in Canada, who are able to withdraw themselves in a certain sense, from the theater of modernity almost entirely, and by that preserve their earlier culture and language. But our situation is not like that. And so I think decolonizing theory means two things. We should try to bend the theory as far as possible, which is within our power, but also at the same time, try to change the education system in such a way that, this peculiar estrangement, something which is my own, but which has been estranged, is overcome for people who are, the younger people, because the world belongs to people. It's the young people to whom the world belongs. I would simply, I'll finish by quoting a remark from Derrida. I'm not very influenced by Derrida's thinking, but I find it very remarkable, this sentence. He says that I have only one language, and even that is not my own. I think this is also true of us in theory. It's not in terms of the natural language, but because it's a theoretical language and not a natural language, we do not see how true that is even for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudipta.
I'm finished, Sanjeev.
Yeah, thank you, Sudipta. We had very thought-provoking interventions and presentations by the panelists. Now the floor is open for questions and comments, but I would request everybody, since our session is for 2 hours and we started a bit late, so I would request everybody to be very brief with their questions or comments. So it's open now.
It's strange that in a gathering of Indians, no one has anything to say.
Can I come in, Sanjeev? Is Vishnu here?
Vishnu, why can't we see you?
Oh, I didn't realize that. I didn't have the video. Yeah, sorry. Yes.
Please yourselves, whoever is speaking.
My name is Vishnu Mahapatra. I teach in a university in the south of India called Kriya University. I have 2 or 3 things to say. First of all, I congratulate Aditya for the book. I have not fully read the book. I've read 3 chapters as yet, and I am immensely enjoying it. I have 3 things to say. One is that the point which has been made by others. It's about the one way of decolonizing. This is the kind of proposing the Indian languages and Indian literature, whether we look at that as a resource that might help us to decolonize. And when I say Indian languages, it's not as a medium of instruction that you find a lot in these days. If you go to many degree colleges, you find that politics is taught in Odia or Bengali or in Tamil or in Kannada. But what I mean is that looking at the language as a constitutive function of the way we use conceptual resources. So maybe, there is, maybe that's a territory that we haven't used quite deeply, although there are very good instances in the past, but that's something, a resource that we can use. And for that, of course, we need a lot of efforts, as Sudipta pointed out. I think, that's something which I think we should keep in mind. And therefore, that leads me to the second question, which is this, I want you to also reflect a bit about our location as a discipline of politics or political science. Is this, why is it that we really love that much about the discipline? There's a critique of the discipline as a whole is necessary. And that takes me to the next question. Is this, I think with Partha I mentioned, who are these we? Who is actually feeling that modernity is actually taken over the world? Who is feeling that they don't have an outside? Who is saying that I have completely been subsumed? Who is this? And is this a kind of description of empirical description of what we are, or this is a kind of scaling up something of what we feel and see that as a kind of general predicament? I want Aditya to reflect a bit on that, because often we think that this is the predicament, but that actually a very limited story that we know from various other examples. Finally, I think theory part, which I thought, one way of thinking about doing decolonizing theory is a critical gathering up exercise. It's not really even within. It is dispersed. Not merely the power is dispersed, even our capacity of theorizing where it is located, where it is employed, where it is come as a skill, where it has come as capacity, where it has come as a pure common sense, where it has come as a critique. They're all dispersed. They're dispersed in the way people do things, but it's also dispersed across society and practices. And maybe, decolonizing theory is a way of critical gathering up, rather than looking for a domain. I think I would stop here, but I want to say to Aditya that I immensely enjoying the book, and we, like many who said, we're also thinking along these lines for a long time. And by reading something like this, it's again a sense that we get another anchor, another opportunity to rethink, to reflect on this thing. And thank you very much, Aditya.
Thanks.
Thank you, Vishnu. If there are other questions and comments, please feel free.
Yeah, may I ask a question?
Surely, yeah.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Orunoday Mujumdar, and I am a doctoral student of sociology in JNU. And I have been lucky to be a student of Professor Nigam, Professor Kaviraj during the Researching the Contemporary course in CSTS in 2014. And I was lucky to have a very small, short interaction with Professor Chatterjee when I started my MPhil in CSSC, but I returned to Delhi School of Economics. My question is this, that, this decolonization is something that we are all grappling with. And at the same time, I think this question has been raised quite a number of times, that what happens, when we decolonize, or when we look beyond what we have studied during as students during our BA and our MA and our MPhils, and even in our PhDs, because once we are out of, the European or the North American models of doing of understanding society and politics, we are then left with, for instance, I study the Anna Hazare movement, and and the moment you move there, there is something which hits you in the face, and that is religion. Because again, the question of language, because religion actually seems to be, like a Hanuman or a Yadav Baba. These are actually characters through which the people on the ground talk. And then there is almost an obvious danger of this, of a relation between this and Hindutva politics. So how is it that we kind of traverse this minefield of indigenous theory, which always has the dark shadow of something which is violent, and which can often be violent. To put it very briefly, in the decolonizing context, what is the philosophy of dharma vis-a-vis religion? Or how do we approach dharma, which is so widespread in our ethnographic fields, vis-a-vis religion?
Yes, thank you, Arunoday. Any other questions and comments?
I'm sorry, I cannot switch on my internet, switch on the video because my internet connection is poor. My apologies for that. So I am Siddhartha Mukherjee. I am doing a PhD in Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal University. I haven't read the book, but it was extremely enlightening to listen to the panelists. I just have a question. Talking about decolonization and the question of language and politics, my question is, if you're trying to move away from politics a little bit and think about other kinds of histories, for example, histories of technology and science, how would a project of decolonization work when we are trying to write histories of Western technologies? Like, for example, the railways, or something like electricity, or maybe, something like the metro, and so on. These are technologies which have their origins in the West. We do not have any kind of, accounts that talk about these technologies before they came into being in the West. So how would a history be written which is interested in the question of decolonization, but is grappling with histories of technology whose origins are Western? Thank you.
Yes, any other comments, please?
Hello. I'm a media student, and I had a question. How do you think reception or perception of strict categorization such as communalism, secularism, and nationalism have changed over the years? Are we still not dependent on colonial way of knowledge gathering for the construction and establishment of the past and its memories, making the present a site of conflict? And I ask this question given that we see a subaltern participation in current fascism in India, and also ossification of scholarship on elite activities when it comes to understanding people participation.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Myself, Dr. Pramod Rai. I teach in a degree college in Odisha. I'm happy that I'm a student of Professor Kaviraj, and I worked with also CSDS on the election studies. So, although I have not gone detail into the Professor Nigam's book, but I have a fundamental question. He mostly dealt with, and the panelists has discussed very rightly. But I have a very, the most baffling and the grappling question we are still hunting. And as Professor Kaviraj has rightly very pointed out in most of the writings on decolonization, decolonizing social science theories, which was reflected in Stabenhagen's Decolonizing Social Science Research also. So my point is, point of question, the terminology and institution used by social scientists internationally to discuss history, economics, society, and culture are based on Western standards and theories. That is quite obvious. But how, as Professor Kaviraj has pointed out, what could Professor Nigam could have consented? How will do away with it? Can we just? My point. Can't we just do away with the Western theory? And what could be the parameters and the Indianizing, like Kautilya's Arthashastra, and I remember the Kautilya's, the Saptanga theory and other things, more or frequently reflected in most of the Western thinkers. In Machiavelli and Kautilya wrote long back to Machiavelli, but we more emphasize the Western theory of Machiavelli's statecraft instead of the Kautilya. How can we know? The language is again another question. So can Professor Nigam can point out these particular aspects of and highlight more on that. Thank you.
I want to ask a question, just a simple question. Hi, am I allowed? Yeah. I'm Achyut. I teach at St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. So I am just encouraged to ask this question. I was feeling very diffident in asking this because I was not very sure whether I understood the term theory very well in the very title of the book. But because I'm asking this question because Professor Nigam in the very beginning made a mention of the clanging of bells that Modi asked Indians to do, and that it was a very popular exercise, a kind of, let me use the word practice for that, which was used. And he said that this did not happen. This hadn't happened when I wrote the book. So I was wondering if he had written the book later, or maybe even the introduction of the book later, after having seen that there is a section of Indian society, or a vast section of Indian society, which actually is still not colonized at all. Or maybe, I don't know, what would you think of that kind of a practice, and what is the relationship between the kind of epistemic world or epistemological world that these people inhabit and the world that you are talking about, the world which is largely pedagogical, formal, and academic. And I will just one anecdotal example that I'd like to give, because Professor Kaviraj and Manindra ji was also talking about these same issues. They were talking about the uneven colonization, which is happening, because the idea was that colonization hasn't affected all societies or all places in a similar manner. So there are pockets within India, which is quite a diverse country, which are not equally colonized. I'm just connecting with that. So when we were asked, on the day when this lighting of the candle and the clanging of the bells and thalas was happening, many of us went to our terraces to watch which pockets of this city are actually celebrating this or doing it in the same way or not. That actually gave a very interesting picture of how the unevenness of the relationship between theory and practice in India still persists in 2020. I don't know, how would you have done this if, yeah.
Hello, sir. Good evening.
Yeah.
Good evening. I am Indubhushan
1 minute.
Mahapatra. So I have a very. Can I, sir?
1 minute, please. Hold on for a minute. Aditya,
Okay.
The chat box. Please look up those questions when you answer at the end. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir. So good evening, sir, to you all. I am Indubhushan. I am speaking from UP. So I have a very brief question to you, that so we are talking of decolonialization in an age of globalized world. Number two, that what I feel, the need of decolonization is more for the intellectuals, because the more intellectual that you have internalized lot more Western concepts and theories. But when you talk of the rustic Indians, you talk of the, regional people, they are least bothered about the Western concept and theories. So I feel that the need of decolonialization is more for the intellectuals. Thank you, sir.
Yes. I think Sunalini also had a question.
If I may just add a tiny addendum to the question that Achyut asked, only because I missed Aditya's opening remarks. And in fact, this is one of the things that I had, if I'd had more time, I might have mentioned, which is that, I'm wondering if, because Aditya, you're marshalling the idea of the Puranic, right? Along with the idea of the paramodern, to understand practices that are, outside the realm, outside what is constituted by colonialism and modernity, very broadly speaking. But this whole thing of clanging of the thalis, the Modi celebration that he sort of, he asked the people to make that gesture for him and they responded. And you have an article in Kafila, I'm sorry, it's not in your book, but you did mention it in your opening remarks, it seems. So I want to just comment on that. You have this article on Kafila where you say, on Shekhar Gupta, where you say that the clanging of the thalis and the diyas, lighting of the diyas, was a deliberate manipulation of the Puranic element. And so I'm wondering and this might be a question that, others may have had and asked in different ways, but I'm just wondering if the Puranic is being made to do too much work, the concept of the Puranic. Does it actually hold the weight of the paramodern? Which I think is a very important concept. In the way that you have used it in your book. So if the Puranic can be manipulated in the service of the dictator, then what does it mean then? Sorry.
I am Jayaramu from Bangalore. Can I go ahead?
Just a request, Professor Sanjeev, there are around 300 participants who are watching on Facebook. They are also making some comments. Can we take some questions from Facebook?
Yeah, surely.
No, I am Jayaramu.
I will send personal messages to you. I will just copy the message and send it to you. Or I will paste it in the chat box.
You paste it in the chat box.
Yeah.
So, I am Jayaramu trying to speak. Just give me a minute's time. Can you?
Yeah.
Can I go ahead? Yeah, okay.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I am Jayaramu. I taught political science in Bangalore University for long years. Very happy to have seen Sudipta Kaviraj and listened to his discourse. Very brief though. Your wife, sir, your wife and myself were PhD fellows together in SIS JNU. Anyway, that's apart. I have sent a question or two to Professor Aditya Nigam. I'm sure he will, try and answer them. Maybe I have given my, mail ID also. He can send it to me, his reply, as and when he finds time. Now, the point I'd like to make here is, this is a point where I would like to carry forward an argument which Professor Sudipta Kaviraj made. Asking for decolonization of theory is one thing, but the time has come when we have to understand the richness of our vernacular languages. And I have sent it in the chat box. I am a Kannadiga from Bangalore. We have to rediscover the values of Basava philosophy and his Anubhava Mantapa, discourse. Anubhava Mantapa of Basavanna or Basaveshwara is something which is being talked about. Of course, the people have not written much in English, but then in the vernacular language, in our own language, in Kannada, people have referred to the richness of his contributions and how it can lead us not only to understand questions of power, its relationship with state, and its linkage with governments. So I go along with Professor Sudipta Kaviraj when he says, and also Partha when he says that we must go back to our languages, particularly the richness of many of our vernacular languages. But I suppose it's an enterprise which all of us will have to do. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sanjeev, I wanted to add something.
Surely. Yes.
this is on the question of language, the last remark and also Partha's remark. I think if we go back to Partha's remark, that now through the education process, very large number of students in the universities are studying in the vernacular, right? But what I find very interesting is that the natural language is the vernacular. So they're reading in Bengali or Hindi or Kannada. But the conceptual language that they get through that is European. Because what they are learning in Bangla is still essentially a copy of the syllabus that I studied in business college in English. So I think the question, the point of the last remark is that the use of the language is also a complex thing, because there's always this question of the natural language and the conceptual language. And going into the natural language and accessing a conceptual language, indigenous conceptual language, I think is much harder.
Okay. Aditya, I have a question. I think modernity itself. Yes.
Partha wants to say something.
No. Sanjeev, go ahead. I'll come back later.
Okay. Modernity itself, there are deep contradictions within modernity. Say the concept of the self, which Kant offers, and the acquisitive, possessive self, which actually exists, or the contradiction between the universalism of modernity and nationalism, and the violence and wars which come with nationalism, which is more para-modern than modern. And finally, the point which I want to make is the other contradiction is the contradiction between liberal bourgeois individualism and democracy. This is a contradiction which has not been resolved. And if we think of democratizing modernity, democratizing knowledge systems, and democratizing the idea of the subject, that it's not only the Western subject of self, which is the agent, others, the non-West is also an equal agent. So the thing which the point which I'm trying to make is there is the unfinished project of democracy within modernity, which has to be addressed, and which is in a sense universal. So thank you with that. Yes, Partha.
I thought of actually making a remark in relation to the earlier point that Sudipta was making about the life of various political concepts in the Indian languages, in the contemporary Indian languages. And if you think of, specifically about textbooks and what is taught in colleges and universities in the various Indian languages, yes, of course, these concepts try as far as possible to replicate and translate as accurately as possible what is said about these concepts in English textbooks. But that is not where it stops. You see, if you think of something like democracy and all of those concepts that are associated with democracy, things like freedom, equality, rights. Now, these are all terms which political science books will define them in particular ways. But these are words and ideas associated with those words which circulate outside that sphere. They circulate in journalism. They circulate in television talk shows. They circulate in political speeches of leaders. And that is what I'm suggesting is where the actual life of these concepts in the Indian languages, that is where they are lived. And obviously we know from our own experience that they take on very different meanings there. And that, I think, is really what we need to think of. What Aditya is suggesting is this zone of the non-synchronous or the para-modern. It's not simply going back to something that was prior to the intervention of all of these other things. But the interventions are deep. And that, I think, is what we need to think about.
Any other comments or questions?
Manindra has.
Okay. So I think we can ask Aditya to reply and make his final comments and observations.
Thank you. That's actually a lot to respond to. And I must say thanks a lot for some very, very important questions, some very thoughtful questions, which also point out to certain obvious absences or gaps in the book. The gap is partly structural in the sense that, for example, the language question, which has come up repeatedly in various ways, first in Manindra's question and his reference to Dari Prasad Dwivedi's Anandas Kapotha or other writings, but also came up in the question in the context of Vishnu's asking about language and literature as literature as resource for decolonization. And I think Partha, Sudipta, various comments actually have raised the language question. It's just that I would say I have absolutely no disagreement on this. In fact, one of the reasons why we started a Hindi research journal in CSDS was precisely because we wanted to provide a forum, not just for, and that is where I think the question just raised by both Sudipta and Partha, that the question of conceptual practice within Hindi language, whether the immediate concepts that we are using are coming as translations from English, or whether sometimes we are actually, unbeknownst to ourselves, accessing from a cultural repertoire. So when I use the term Puranic here, it may sound very odd, but in Hindi and in many other languages, but in Hindi, the term Puranpanthi is a term which is used very commonly to refer to a particular kind of mindset. I'm not using it here in exactly the same sense, but the term Puranpanthi is supposed to be not just backward and reactionary and whatever, which it also has acquired that sense in modernist use, but it is also referred to by the more high textual Hindu, the Shastrik Hindu, who kind of rejects the Puranic and the popular elements of Hinduism, especially in the modern during the 19th and 20th centuries. So Puranpanthi refers therefore to a larger universe. Now, so that is why the language question is absolutely central here. I have absolutely no doubt that if you are to look at the non-synchronous element, the past within the present, the so-called past, so that I don't use the term past, that's why I'm using the term non-synchronous synchronicities, that basically these are elements which are part of our present. The access to that universe is only through language. It is only through the vernacular language. Vernacular meaning in the sense in which we use for non-English and non-classical languages. So there, I think I wanted to thank everybody for bringing that up, but also giving me the opportunity, therefore, to clarify this particular point. I think Manin's other thing about KJ Shah, JPS Subrai, I think obviously the number of different enterprises that were going on during this period, some of them tied up. I mean, in a sense, JPS Subrai's thing also ties up at some level with what was going on in CSTS, but certainly there were many others which I am not aware of. Some which have got left out simply for reasons of my lack of that kind of familiarity. I'm aware of a little bit of work of KJ Shah and of JPS Subrai, but not enough for me to actually make very confident statements about where they stand in this whole picture. I have some sense of it, but so these are obviously reasons why some of those are gaps. Now, a couple of other things I do want to clarify. I will probably take most of these obviously as questions to think further. Yes, one point which I think Manindra raised about the social and political, I think my point, I have no disagreement with what you said, but I think my point is here with the social as we understand it in modern times. It is not the society of varnas and jatis and their various closed groups and so on. That's not the social really. So when I'm talking of the social and political, it is actually the emergence of a particular kind of formation of society in modern times, and which is now part of our, I mean, we live it. So that it is in that sense. One question I think which I must clarify a bit in relation to Partha's points, or two, three things actually. One is the question of the mandala. You referred, Partha, to the Arthashastra text, but that is only one reference actually. But the way I have discussed mandala is from a number of different sources, including anthropology. So where anthropologists have actually seen, for example, Stanley Tambaya's Galactic Polity, with which I actually begin, where he talks about the cosmologies of Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies, which in a way find some kind of resonance with the political formation and structures in Southeast Asia, in South and Southeast Asia. Now, that is one kind of reference. The other kind of reference which actually arises when you look at Clifford Gates's work on Nagara in the Indonesian context, or James Scott's thing on the Zomya, the hill formations in the art of not being governed. Now, that is one set of ways in which the idea of the very stylized form of mandala in the Arthashastra actually is not what we find in its different forms, which is why I have also spent a long time actually discussing the debate within contemporary historians in the like in the 60s and 70s. Historians who have talked about segmented polity, segmentary state, and so on and so forth. And there, I think in many different ways, the concept of mandala keeps coming in practical terms. It doesn't always adhere to the stylized definitions if you want to derive them from the Arthashastra, for example. So that is one thing I wanted to say, that my attempt was to draw from both historical and anthropological scholarship alongside notions, lived notions perhaps, of these concepts. The other point on which I actually wanted to make a very short clarification is the point about Kalyan Sanel. I don't really think I have no disagreement on that part, but my point about Sanel was that when he finally comes to enunciate his theoretical model, his question is, how do we think of non-capital or pre-capital in such a way that what you're talking of the reduction of the gap, he's saying actually there will never be a situation where capital will totally supersede non-capital, because non-capital is itself posited by capital. So his solution to the problem is by making that past retrospectively posited by capital itself. That's the way I read him. One other clarification, which I think probably I haven't actually argued in the book, that the genealogies of different components or different constituents of what comes to be the modern, even though they come from different and other parts of the world, they're not actually, I have nowhere made this argument that therefore this is not a European product. In fact, I emphasize that despite sourcing them from different parts of the world, this is a particular configuration which comes into existence in Europe. It is fashioned in Europe. And it is fashioned in Europe in a particular way where the discourse of rights, the discourse of the individual, and the certain discourse of secularization and secularism, these frame them in a particular way. Now, there are other questions, and too many other questions, in fact, but I don't think I can take all of them. Two other points I wanted to make quickly. One is the question which was raised by a couple of questioners later about I think it all ties up in the sense there was one question by Soma Basu about subaltern participation in fascism, the communal secular question, and then the Puranic and Sunalini's question about, which relates also to other questions about the Puranic. Now, one thing I want to clarify, I don't know, I'm forgetting who asked, but when I said this hadn't happened when I had written, it doesn't mean that there's something new happened for me. Actually, what I was saying was that in a way this book anticipated that moment where the Puranic element was actually enacted in a fairly bizarre way, which we've not probably seen the likes of in a long while. But, and here I should clarify that when I use the term Puranic, again, no concept actually sticks to its original classical meaning. When you work on a concept, the concept has to actually become more, it should be able to speak to other contexts and other situations. And one thing which I actually illustrate from Shahid Amin's work on Razimia also is that this is not a form or mode of being which is actually specific only to Hindus. It is, you will find it actually pervasive among different segments of the subcontinental population, where there are a number of elements. There is the element of magical relationship. There is an element of spiritual beings which inhabit your life and they determine things. But there is another element which actually relates directly to the way we think about politics, which is that in the Puranic domain, you don't confront evil by organizing demonstrations and strikes and hartals and so on. You propitiate, you appease, you bang thalis, you do whatever. These are the ways in which you actually try to. So Karuna Devi, Karuna goddess, became the newest import of a goddess on whom we have yajnas performed through this period. It's still happening in my society. Also, I hear Shank Tank and all that going sometimes when they're. So this is something which actually through this term I'm trying to capture a number of these elements, very much part of our present. We cannot simply think of them as the past. And they determine the mode of behavior in a certain way. Now, what is the relationship to fascism or to a Hindu right and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that all of them are in. That's certainly not my argument. In fact, my argument about secularism, communalism is precisely that we have forgotten that actually in places where historically monotheism, like Christianity, for example, Islam, the battle against these forms of enchantment, enchanted, whatever, you can't call it religion, but nowadays we call religion, use the term for everything. This form was actually fought not under the banner of science and rationality. It was fought under the banner of a higher spirituality. It was the spirituality of God versus the belief in all this humbug, superstition, etc., etc. That was what was the project of Christianity. That was the project of Islam. We are trying to short circuit all that by doing it with a secular elite aligned to the secular state, trying to do without offering anything, where Christianity offered something, Islam offered something. So that is one level at which the divide between the modern and the Puranic, it becomes so pervasive, and so sometimes the gap is so much, our inability to communicate is so much, but the characters that we are talking about, they live in close proximity to that world. So in a way, this whole thing is tied to a question of epistemic disposition also. That once epistemically dispossessed and driven out of your modern domains of modern life into the paramount, you lose touch, you lose connection, and therefore this entire, so all the debates that we keep having, for example, about how do we relate to religion and so on. I think there was a question on that also. I think it's not just a question of how do we relate to religion in an external way. Question is, can we understand those modes of being, those modes of life? And if we cannot directly have channels of communication, at least are there modern interlocutors? In the sense, let us say, for example, I can think of many believers, sadhus, Ramakrishna Mission, and so on and so forth, who actually straddle both universes in a sense. And on some matters, Ramakrishna Mission kind of position articulates a modern Hindu somewhat rational idea of religion, but is able to speak to the other also, to the Puranic also. So these, I think, are ways of having to rethink the question of religion, enchantment, and so on. I think I'll stop there. There may still be things left, but perhaps I'll have to beg your pardon for not taking up all the questions. I think it's too many questions there.
Okay. Thank you, Aditya. It was a very challenging panel, and I think what I have taken away from this is we can no longer do theory in the old way after Aditya's book. We have to really rethink. And while rethinking, we have, as was pointed out by, I think, Sudipta, that we have to rethink our education system, because our education system does not have space for this kind of philosophical traditions. But there is one thing that we have in our education system. For example, in the philosophy departments of all universities, Indian philosophy is a major subject. But in many new universities, the philosophy departments just don't exist. But even where there are philosophy departments with Indian philosophy, that Indian philosophy section has no relationship, no connection with other humanities and social sciences. So these are the connections which we have to build and rethink our education and really do theory in a new way after Aditya's book. With this, I must thank everybody, and I would now request Kiran Kumar to formally offer a vote of thanks. Kiran.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, sir. I thank Professor Sanjeev Mukherjee for chairing this session. And I know it's very difficult to chair a webinar because we have to maintain and this very big panel, and also you have to maintain the panel and also participants. And it's a very big, long session of 2.5 hours. And I thank on behalf of Dean's Office, School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad, I thank Professor Sanjeev Mukherjee. And I also thank Professor Aditya Nigam, the author of book. And in fact, he raised so many critical issues, and maybe it will create a kind of shift in the theory, in how we look at theory. So, and we also thank entire panel members, Professor Sudipta, Kaviraj, Professor Partha, Chatterjee, Dr. Manindra, Thakur, Dr. Sunalini, Kumar, and it's a very insightful discussion. And in fact, we also wanted to inform the participants. And one side, this kind of webinars, on one side, we can connect panelists across the globe. And we, in fact, today we have participants from South America, Africa, and other Asian countries also. And on Facebook, we have around 300 viewers. They are watching there. We can connect on one side, we can connect people in different parts. On other side, we have the digital divide in the country where they cannot see the synchronous in the live. They cannot participate and watch these videos. But so we are uploading these videos on Facebook and also on YouTube, where you can access, students can access anytime and watch this video again. So on Professor Arun Kumar's Facebook page and also on YouTube page, all these videos will be uploaded. And last but not least, I also thank Professor Arun Kumar Patnaik for initiating this kind of webinars. In fact, he is very active in the school and also in fact in the entire university, who is organizing so many webinars. And in fact, he is also giving so much of works for his research scholars like me to involve in this kind of webinars and to do some kind of work after this webinar also. So, and I also thank all the participants in Zoom and also on Facebook who are watching on Facebook for joining us today. With this note, we will end this session, and it's almost 2.5 hours. And it's just like the University of Hyderabad and JNU used to have post-dinner talks. And we have the post-dinner webinars, sorry, pre-dinner webinars, continuing the post-dinner webinars. So, so this is a kind of new normal we are adjusting to. So with this note, good night to everyone, and also keep safe, keep safe and be happy. So with this note, we'll end this session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.